I'm going to transition into the introduction to our new series. Today we start a new series, and the title of it is Faith in Faithless Times. Faith in Faithless Times. See if I can move this away from here a little bit and get less. There we go. Faith in Faithless Times. You know, I don't know if you would share this perspective or not, but it seems as though over the past decade, increasingly people have less faith. And actually, if you've been sensing that, there are statistics that bear that out. So, for example, in September of this past year, CBS ran a story off of a Pew Research study, and here's just a direct quote from the beginning of that story, September 14th. It said, in the early 90s, about 90% of people living in the United States professed to be a Christian. 90% in the 1990s, so 30 years ago, 90% of our country said they were Christian. What's interesting is you fast forward to 2023, and not so much the number of Christians that are in the country, but you see that's significantly dropped to 64%. But the number that I want to highlight is that those who are no longer affiliated with any kind of faith. You see the statistic there in 2007 was 16%. So back in the 90s, it was very small. It's like 1% to 2% of people who considered themselves what's now called the nones. They have no faith at all. In 2007, you see it was 16%. In 2020, that number went from 16 to 27. Or to 30%. That's a huge increase of people living in our country who say that they have no faith. It's not just in our country, but you also see there's a study that was done in England and Wales, and CNN ran a story about this, and you see the statistics here that 59% of, in 2011, people described themselves as Christian living in those countries. It dropped to 46% by 2021. And then note this statistic. The number of respondents saying they had no religion was the biggest gainer, rising from 25% a decade ago, 2011, to over 37% now. And so I just put the statistics up there to say, if you feel like you're living in a country and around people who less and less people that you interact with have faith, that's the research indicates that. We just have people, more and more people, who just have no faith. Now, some of that is the result, so research has been done. Some of that has been the result, a large part of that has been the result of what began to transpire in the 1960s, in which that was the time in which deconstruction began to occur. And when I use that word deconstruction, obviously it means to just take apart something that's been constructed, but deconstruction used philosophically or for a worldview simply means the idea of taking apart the beliefs that you've held onto. And so that started in the 1960s. And beliefs about the ways that we should behave sexually, that tremendously came down, as well as views of who God is, as well as science and the ideas of who gets to pick and choose. So relativism is now the idea of the day. People get to pick and choose and decide. So the statistic is now that 80% of people would agree with this statement that says just simply this: nobody should help anybody inform anything about their faith. That should be done completely independent of any church, any synagogue, any form of religion. People should do it on their own. 80% of American respondents said that. See, we're living in this culture in which people don't have faith, and yet the reality is they do. This series is about kind of getting into that, getting into the notion that everybody lives by faith. Now, the debate is over what it is that you place your faith in. So some people would say, I'm an atheist. I don't have any faith. Well, the reality is you do have faith, and your faith is that there is no God. You may say, I'm a scientist, and I don't have any faith in a God that has created. Well, the reality is you do have faith, because as a scientist, you believe that there were atoms and things that existed, and there was a bang, and everything came from that. You live by faith, and people live by faith. We can't, it's impossible to exist apart from faith. Another good example of that is what happened on the football field just 2 weeks ago when Damar Hamlin had a heart attack. Right? And the response of the people on the field, his teammates in the stadium, you just saw this huge circle on the field of people on their knees crying because they were realizing the severity of the situation. A human being is no longer breathing. And so they were shook to their core, shaken to their core, listening to the newscasters. Everybody said the same thing. We don't know what to say, just pray. Well, that's interesting. That's an interesting response, isn't it? That as people in times when life is complex, difficult, we don't know what to do. So even though we're faithless, we still act in faith, calling out to who, I don't know, but that was the plea. Pray for Damar. So this series, we're going to get into this, and we're going to reflect upon it, and hopefully help us, all of us who show up on Sunday or engage this during the week or viewing live stream, to dig deeper into their own faith. Maybe you're here because somebody just drug you along, or maybe you're watching this because somebody just said, hey, you got to watch this, and you have no faith. You don't believe in God. That's okay. That's okay. I'm glad that you're here, that you're with us. Or maybe you're here and you are attempting to find faith and you have no faith. And that's okay too. We've all been in this place where we didn't believe, or we were looking, and then maybe some of you are here and you say, I do have faith, but my faith, I'm struggling in my faith, and I have doubts. And I say to that again, that's okay. Great. And maybe some of you are here and your faith is strong, but it needs to be strengthened. And so that's what this series is about. Living in faithless times, increasing our faith. Now, we're going to learn about faith through the life and the example of a man who was somebody who didn't know God. He had no idea who God was when God appeared to him. And he learned what faith was, and he learned to trust in God. And his name is Abram. And so we're going to study through this series the life of Abram, also known as Abraham. His name later was changed to Abraham. And his wife Sarai, whose name later was changed to Sarah. So we're going to study Genesis chapter 11 through 22. And so I invite you in this series to read the book of Genesis. Just make it a daily habit. Some of you are reading through the Bible in the year. And just reading, starting in Genesis. So this is going to go right along with that desire that you have to read through the year. If not, you have no reading plan, I invite you, read the book of Genesis over the next 7 weeks through this series. A little bit of background before we jump into this, and some background on reading the Old Testament. So Stuart and Fee, in their book, How to Read the Old Testament, actually it's How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, but in their section on how to read the Old Testament, they list 5 very helpful tips. And so I'm going to share them with us just really super fast and invite you to kind of remember this as you read. Number 1, whenever you're reading Old Testament is full of narrative. When you do, it's fantastic if you put yourself in the place of the character. And so today, as we read about the story of Abram, I'm going to invite you, as we're reading, to be Abram. Think about what Abraham was thinking, what he was feeling, how he's reacting and responding. Secondly, when you read the Old Testament, look for repetition. The writers of the Old Testament, they use repetition to make a point. You'll see ideas and themes and words that keep getting repeated over and over and over. That is sending us a message about something significant and important. We're going to identify that in the passage that we're about to read. Third, look for things that stick out. They stick out like a sore thumb. They're like a flashing road sign. It's odd. It's weird. Why is this mentioned in this text? Fourth, remember it's a story. Much of the Old Testament is narrative. It's a story. It's telling us about something. And when you read story, it doesn't necessarily mean that the things that are happening in the story are the ways that God is saying, this is good, that he blesses or condones it. Often when we're reading the story, we're going to see this in the life of Abraham, that he was sinful in many ways. And God doesn't say anything about it. But that doesn't mean that he wasn't sinful and that God didn't care. It just means it's a story that wasn't the part of the story. So when you read the Old Testament, you're reading narrative. And this is also true in the New Testament. When you read narrative, remember It's a story. And finally, remember the context, to whom it is written. And so in the Old Testament, it's to the covenant people that God makes a covenant. We're going to find that with Abram as we study the life of Abraham. God makes a covenant with him. And he says, I'm going to do certain things for you. And so the people who then follow after Abraham, those that become his descendants, become covenantal people of God. Those covenants, the covenant, the Abrahamic and the Davidic covenant, which you're going to read about if you do read the book of Genesis, are for those people. The sacrificial practices, for example, the temple, the tabernacle, the priest, the offering of... None of that is for us today. The writer of Hebrews draws all these parallels and helps us to understand that the covenant was for the Old Testament. The Old Testament, by the way, is Old Covenant. Testament just simply is covenant. New Testament is New Covenant. Old Covenant, New Covenant. Those are 5 little things to kind of just keep in the back of your mind. Now, lastly, in terms of background info, as we jump into Genesis chapter 11 is where we're going to begin, but most of the time spent in chapter 12. The background to this is Genesis 1, 2, and 3 is the creation of the world in sin. The 2 key people are Adam and Eve. The next big story is the story of Noah and his sons. And then after that, which that story comprises chapter 5 through chapter 11, after that is the story of Abraham and Sarah, which take up a good chunk of Genesis, and then it's Abraham and Sarah's son Isaac, and Isaac's son Jacob, and Jacob's 12 sons who end up in Egypt. And that's where the book ends in Genesis chapter 50. So that's the background. Now, let's jump into Genesis chapter 11, and really, you should read all of 11, but we don't have time to get into all that. Instead, we're going to start at verse 27. And if you were to read all of 11, you'd encounter the story of Babel, the Tower of Babel, in which God confused the language of people. And then you find this big, long list of people. It's the ancestral line of the characters that we're about to be introduced to. And so as we begin at verse 27, this is what we uncover. This is the account of Terah. Who's he? I don't know, right? He's the son of, if you look at the verse before, you find out who he is, the son of. And that's all we know, really, but we get a little bit of detail here. This is the account of Terah. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran became the father of Lot. And while his father Terah was still alive, Haran died in Ur of the Chaldeans in the land of his birth. Okay, we're just going to pause here. This is a lot of little details. There's a significant warning light. It's really odd information that's given, and it's given on purpose because what's about to follow is some information that will help you to understand more of this story. And so, first of all, there's a bunch of names, and so to kind of unscramble all of this, I put it together in a little diagram. So the little diagram here helps you to see the family tree, right? So it's Terah, who's the father. He has 3 sons, Abram, Nahor, and Haran, right? And Haran died in Ur. That's a little flashing light. Why are we told that Haran died in Ur? Well, it introduces us to a place called Ur. That's why we're informed of this. There's something significant about Ur that we're going to find in the text. But these are the sons, Abraham, Nahor, Haran, and Haran had a son, Lot. But remember that Haran died in Ur. That's pretty important as you then keep reading. So read to the next verse. Abram and Nahor both married. Okay, so that's good. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran. Well, that's interesting. That means he married his niece. The father of both Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was barren, and she had no children. So again, let's do a little next slide here. Breakdown of the family tree. There's Terah. Abram marries Sarah. Nahor marries Milcah. Milcah is one of Haran's children, right? His daughter. And he also has Lot over there in Iscah. All right? And then this significant flashing light that sticks out. Sarah has no children. This is huge. Everything that follows after this is all about this point that Abraham and Sarah have no children. keep reading. Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Abram, and together they set out from that important place that we learned about just a minute ago, of the Chaldeans, to go to Canaan, introduction of a new place. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. Terah lived 205 years, and he died in Haran. So here's a little map, right? And this is modern Iran. Most of this is modern Iran. You see the Persian Gulf down at like 5 o'clock in the map. And you see Ur. Ur is the place where Haran died. You see that Terah takes his family and travels north about 500 miles along the Euphrates River basin. All right, the Euphrates River is still there. This is known as the birthplace of civilization. This is where the world began, where people from the world came from. Archaeologists have studied this region. It's rich with all kinds of history, enabling archaeologists to date that these activities of Abraham are probably over 4,000 years old, sometime around 2000 to 1900 BC. So Terah takes his son to Haran, about 500 miles by foot. Now, did they travel upstream in a boat? How they got there, we don't know. But this is what we're told where they went. Now, why did they go to Haran? We don't know. How did they end up in We don't know. But it's possible, in some conjecture, that they go to Haran because Haran actually is the home of Terah. Why? Well, do you recognize that one of Terah's sons is named Haran? They traveled to where? Haran. Is it possible that maybe they named Terah named his son Haran after, back home? Kind of like Elizabethtown is named Elizabethtown after Elizabeth, right? So it's very possible that they're just going back home. Now, the other thing that we learn in this interesting little travel here is that Terah lives 205 years. And that'll become interesting in just a moment. Now, let me just pause and reflect, which I ran past really quickly, was Sarah's, the fact that she was barren. The fact that she was barren, there's two things that are important about this. Number one, it highlights the significance of children in the life of a family unit. So in this time, if a man did not have any children, he had nobody to pass his name on to, nobody to pass his possessions on to. Secondly, the woman had nobody to invest in. And then finally, they had nobody when they were getting old to take care of them or to bury them. And so not having any children, this is pretty significant part of the story. And then the second part is what I highlighted already, and that is that this is a flashing sign that this is significant to the life of Abram and Sarah, and everything that's going to follow is dependent upon this little statement that they had no children. Now, put yourself in Abraham and Sarah's life. Put yourself in the story. How do you think? How do you feel? What's life like? You don't have any kids. Your brother and brother-in-law have a family. You don't have any family. Some of you have never had children. Some of you have longed to have children. You can identify more easily with that than the others who here maybe have had children. But what is life like for somebody who hasn't had children but would long to have them? Right? There's certain emotions and feelings that we have, important to be aware of as we move into chapter 12. As we move into chapter 12, this is what we find. Beginning in verse 1, the Lord had said to Abram, and I'm going to just pause here for a second. This is the first time that God is introduced to this story. This is the first time the Lord is mentioned. If you read all of chapter 11, the last time he was mentioned, it was in the beginning of chapter 11 in the story of Tower of Babel, in which he came down and confused the languages. This is the first time that God is introduced into the life and story of Abraham and Sarah. Now, this is pretty significant because what most of us probably are unaware of and aren't thinking through is that at this point in Abram's life, he never knew who the Lord was. Now, when you read your English, the Lord is capital, all capital letters, right? L-O-R-D, which Old Testament writers, the nation of Israel, Jews, would never speak the name of God. And this references the name of God. This references God. And when they're speaking, when you read the Lord, what that means is the one who is above all. The one who is sovereign over all, the one from whom everything that exists because it came from him. God. This is the first time that God and Abraham meet. Or shall we say it the other way around, that Abraham meets God. Now, there's this little interesting verse in Joshua chapter 24, verse 2, that goes something like this. Your forefathers, let me read it for you. Long ago, your forefathers, including Terah, the father of Abraham, and Nahor, lived beyond the river, and they worshiped other gods. They worshiped other gods. They worshiped other gods. They were pagan. They didn't know the God of the universe. And so here Abraham at 75 years old, highly likely he had ever had any encounter with God. And so you may be here this morning and have never had an encounter with God. You don't know who God is. That's okay. The guy that we're reading about, he never had an encounter with God either. For 75 years, he lived his life, highly likely that he lived his life worshiping some other form of some God. And we know from ancient history, the ancient people had all kinds of gods. But none of them was the one true God who created all that is. And so here we find that God breaks the silence. He breaks into Abram's life. Remember, Abram has no idea who this God is. How he breaks the silence, how he comes into his life, it's not explained in the text. It just says, the Lord said to Abram. I'd love to know how he said it. Did he speak in a dream? Did he whisper to him? How did he communicate this? The text doesn't tell us. And interestingly, when you read the Old Testament and even into the New Testament, God, it's difficult to understand and to know how it is that God appears or God speaks to people. We do see examples of him speaking in dreams. We do see examples of him speaking to his prophets through a word. Somehow he speaks to them in a word that the prophets get, and then they deliver the message. Sometimes he appears in what's called a theophany. We're going to see that a little bit later in this text, where somehow he appears in some way in the story of Gideon riding along on his donkey and faces an angel, the angel of the Lord who appears. Right? But we don't know. All we know is that Abraham, again, put yourself in his shoes. You're 75 years old. You've worshiped. You've had faith. You've got down on your knees and you prayed in hard times, but you were praying to pagan gods. You've never had any idea who God is. And the Lord speaks to Abraham. Now you're 75 years old. This is the first time you hear him. And this is what God tells you. God says this. He says, leave your country, leave your people, and leave your father's household. Well, that's an interesting little conversation. Like, what? Like, can you tell me more about who you are? Can you tell more about what you're up to? Can we, talk about this? Like, you want me to leave my country, my people, and my father's household? And you want me to go to the land that you're going to show me? And then God says this, I will make you into a great nation and I will bless you. Two blessings. He's going to bless Abram. I'm going to make you into a great nation and bless you. I'm going to make your name great. So those are your two blessings. I'm going to turn you into a great nation. And I'm going to make your name great. Now remember, you're Abraham and you're Sarah. And remember earlier we learned, flashing red light, that you have no children. And God appears to you and says, leave your family, leave your country, go to this place that you have no idea where it is, that I'm going to, somehow I'm going to show you, and I'm going to turn you into a great nation to give you a great name. Got any questions? And then he says, I will bless those who bless you. So this is interesting. I'm going to bless other people through you. And not only that, I'm going to bless all the peoples on the earth. They will be blessed through you. So again, this is an interesting little story here, a few little details, and two commands, right? I want you to leave and I want you to go. And the leaving thing, think of the implications to this. I want you to leave everything you know, basically. I want you to leave everything that you're comfortable with, right? I want you to give it all up. I want you to leave your family. I want you to leave your country. If you ever left the United States, we have our Ghana team that just came back. Is it great to be home, guys? Yeah, it's great to be in Ghana. Yeah, it's great to be home, though. This is your country. It's your food, your people, your language, right? It's your country. I want you to leave your country. I want you to leave your family. Was it great to go to Ghana? Yeah. Great to hang out with all, 600 kids who outperform, that's the wrong word, out-sing us, they dance and yell's probably not the right word, but from the bottom of their lungs is one of the things that my son came home and said, man, Dad, these kids, they out-worship us in a major way. I mean, they're just insane. But anyways, there's another story, right? The kids, those of you who are back from Ghana, right? Your own country, your own people. Right? Think of what this is that God is asking Abram to do. Give up all of this. Give up everything that's comfortable and known, relationally, place that you know. Think of how that feels for you as a person to pack it in and go someplace you've never been. Some of you have moved across the country. Some of you have done this, but you stayed in the country. Some people have left here and have gone overseas and have made a life overseas. We have several ministry partners who are doing that. It's pretty extreme. This is what God is asking Abram to do. I want you to leave and I want you to go. Pack it up and do this. Does anybody have any questions about this? For me, as I read this through, it's first of all, why me, God? If you're Abraham, why me? Why are you appearing to me? Why are you asking me to do this? Can you give me a little bit more definition? Secondly, where are you taking me? Why don't you tell me? Just go. This is so random. Go where? Please, a little more definition, a little more description. And why? Why do you want me to leave my family? Why do you want me to leave my country? Whatever it is that you want to do, can't you do that right here? Why do I have to? Do you have these questions? There's all kinds of questions that Abram must have had. But then we read the next verse. Chapter 4. So Abram left. Abram left. Now, don't you think that would have to take an immense amount of faith? To just say, okay, I'm going to leave, right? I'm going to trust that this God, who I never met, never heard from before, is actually going to do what it is that he says. I wrote this in my notes. This is a complete act of faith in a God he is just getting to know. He chooses to trust and obey rather than to doubt and to stay. Right? And so this is what he does. So Abraham leaves as the Lord had told him. And Lot went with him. That's interesting. It's important. Later on, another story. We're going to read about this. Abram was 75 years old. His dad died at 205. Abraham's 75 years old. It means his father lived for another 60 years. So think of this. You're leaving your family. He took his wife Sarah, his nephew Lot, all the possessions that they had accumulated and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. Now, why the land of Canaan? How did they go to Canaan? Why did they pick Canaan? Well, Canaan was introduced earlier, right? But here's the map that shows what they did. Father Terah, when they were living in Ur, said, hey, let's leave and let's go to Canaan. Look, it's a big bell curve, right? You see that? Why didn't they go directly from Ur right on over there to, you see the bottom there at what's that, 8 o'clock Hebron? That's the nation of Israel right there. Why didn't they just go straight line from Ur? Well, because you see, the Arabian desert, right? So they went north. They went northwest up the Euphrates River, but they settled in Haran. And now Abram obeys. and he leaves Haran, makes this several 100-mile journey down southwest into Canaan. Why Canaan? We don't know why Canaan. There's no description why Canaan. As a matter of fact, Hebrews 11 tells us, next slide I think has it on there. Julia, can you go to the next slide? Hebrews 11, there it is. By faith, Abram, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, he obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. He didn't know where he was going. Think of how crazy that is. Do you have any questions about this? Does this sound a little bit weird, a little funky? Like you're just going to listen to a God who you're just getting introduced to, and you're just going to follow him and just going to go where? You got it. We all a bunch of details we don't know. And then what happens next in the story is that so Abraham traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moriah at Shechem. At the time the Canaanites were in the land, the Lord appeared to Abram. There it is, God appears to Abram. This is the first time that we know that he appears to him. Earlier, God said to him, here he appears to him. In what form, how, we don't know. But the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So now he knows he's in the right place. This is the land, this is the place. And so he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. This is an act of worship. It's like, okay, God, I've been trusting you in faith. Now I'm worshiping you. I believe who you are. I believe what you're saying. And then verse 8, from there he went on towards the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west, the Ai on the east, and there he built an altar to the Lord. Again, he builds another altar, and he calls on the name of the Lord. Then Abram set out and continued toward the Negev, which is down by the Dead Sea. And what do we make of all of this? What's the application for all of this for us today, living today? You may be here today and you may have no faith. You may have doubting faith. You may be struggling. And in this story, you find a man who had really no faith of who God is, no understanding of who God is. But what we find in this story is that God introduces himself. And something that we learn about God, there's a couple things I wrote down. It's like, here's some things that I think we learn about God in this story. Number one, he's the ruler, right? He's in charge. He's above everything. He created everything that is. He oversees all that is. There's a God. Secondly, he's a planner. He's got a plan. He's up to something. He's going to do something. He's going to accomplish something. This is the beginning of that plan. Actually, the beginning of the plan was Genesis 1, 2, and 3. And then we see that this other thing about who God is he's a judge. He expects that you're going to obey what it is that he says because he's got a plan and he wants you to follow what it is that he says. And if you don't do what he says, there's going to be consequences. And so we see that in the beginning of Genesis. And there's also this sense in which Abraham, if you don't follow the plan, there's going to be consequences for you. But the other thing we find out about God is patient. He's patient working out his plan. He doesn't just do it instantly. He doesn't give all the information. He doesn't give all the details. He just says, this is what I want you to do. He just gives you one step. Will you trust me in the one step? He doesn't work out his whole plan. He could have just made a whole bunch of people from Abraham and then boom, there's my nation of people. But he didn't. He starts with a man and a woman who have no children, and he says, I'm going to turn you into a great nation. For those of us who read the story now, we know that's exactly what happened. But if you put yourself in the situation of Abram, you don't know how. But God is patient. This is what we learn. He's going to work out his plan. He's good. God is good. He works good out of the bad. We're going to find through this story a whole lot of bad choices that Abram and Sarah make. But God keeps working good out of the bad. Through what we saw earlier in Genesis, God works good out of the bad. The world sins, people sin. God brings destruction, but he works good. We see over and over his grace demonstrated. And he's also kind. He's about blessing the entire world. He's about blessing people who bless Abram, blessing the entire world. He's kind. He's good. This is what we learn about this God. I'm going to ask our worship team to come up, and as we do, I just have a couple questions for us to think about. Abraham took an act of faith in a God he didn't fully know. Think of the implications of that one choice. He chose to leave and go. He could have chose to stay and not obey, but he chose to leave and go. And because he chose to leave and go, something happened. He ended up in a place. That place became the nation of Israel. Through him came a child, Isaac. From Isaac came Jacob and Esau. From Jacob came 12 sons. From those 12 sons came a whole nation of 2 million people who went to Egypt. Out of Egypt came a man named Moses. And out of Egypt, the nation went. And as they entered back into the promised land that Abraham went, God gave it to them, drove out the nations. All these people live by faith. Eventually, there's a king, David, who lives by faith. And through the line of David, who comes through the line of Abraham, comes a man, the God-man, Jesus Christ, who's the fully God, fully man, king of the universe, king of the Jews, king of the nation of Israel. And through him come 12 followers. And through those 12 followers come significant people and significant historical figures that you can go back and look at. For example, there's a guy by the name of Polycarp, and we have all kinds of writings. He was a direct disciple of John the Apostle. We can go and we can read of the Clement of Rome, who was a direct disciple of the Apostle Peter. Two of these guys hung out with Jesus, were transformed by him. Those two men that I just mentioned became huge pillars in the early church, early 100s. And from them came people like Augustine and Athanasius, and into the Middle Ages and out of the Middle Ages, and through Luther, the Reformation, and Tyndale, and Calvin, and John Bunyan, and Newton, and William Wilberforce, who led the whole ending of slavery in England, and George Mueller, man, and Hudson Taylor, who lived by immense faith. And then into the modern era of C.S. Lewis and Billy Graham and Norman Geisler and Lee Strobel and William Lane Craig and Josh McDowell, all powerful apologists today, all because Abraham listened to God and in one act of faith obeyed. And thousands of years of life change and the gospel going out, all because Abraham listened and obeyed. I got a question for us. What act of faith is God inviting you on? What is he calling you to do? Perhaps you're here this morning and this is the first time you're getting engaged with this God. Maybe it's time for you to say, God, I'm tired of being the God of my life. Maybe that step of faith is to just say, God, I'm tired of being God of my life. I want you to be the God of my life. Or maybe you're in this place in which God is nudging you to say, hey, look, it's time for you to give it up. Quit trying to figure out the answers to the why questions that you have for the bad that's in your life, for the hardships that's in your life. I want you to just let it go. Just trust me and live your life by faith. Or maybe it is that God has been nudging you, and it has been God who's been nudging you to go say something to a neighbor or to a coworker or to a family member, and you know God's been nudging you, but you haven't gone. What might happen because you leave and you go? Or maybe God has been nudging you to, yes, be the person to say, I will sign up. I'll be that person who will teach in the second hour for our kids, or I will serve in this way in the life of the church because God is the one who's been nudging me to do that. Is God nudging you to take an active step of faith, to do something? What is that? I know God's at work. He's at work in us as a church. He's at work in us as individuals. But are we living wimpy faith, little faith? Do we need to take big steps of faith? Worship team, lead us.
Man, would you please stand with us?